was the story about Jesus going off into the hills to pray and be alone for a while, and his followers going out on the lake in a boat. But during the middle of the night, a huge storm came up. The boat rocked back and forth, back and forth. And the disciples, the followers, were afraid they were going to capsize. They huddled together in fear. Suddenly, in that dark storm, they seemed to see an apparition coming toward them. And some of them thought, well, that was really Jesus. And the apparition seemed to say, fear not, fear not. But one was really doubting and said, I'm not sure that's really you. Prove it. You seem to be walking on the water. Make me walk on the water too, then I'll know. So, that apparition that seemed to be Jesus said, well, come ahead. Come ahead. So Peter, doubting, put one leg over the side of the boat, climbed out, started to walk on the water. Everything seemed fine. And then he began to sink. And Jesus, it is said, took him, raised him up, and saved him and said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" The women who were reading the scripture began to talk it over. Think about it. How did it apply to their lives right now? And they began to talk about the situation in their neighborhoods. What was happening was that there was gang warfare. Every night it was like war. People were getting shot. And now it was starting to happen during the daytime. There were bullets going through some of the house walls. The women were having to run to the church and run back as though they could escape any danger. Run to the store, run back. So they began to talk about their situation of 8 gangs, each with a piece of the turf, at war. And they began to talk about the scripture. And one woman said, "You know, I know exactly what we're supposed to do." Whoops! We are supposed to get out of our boat. Right now, get out of our boat. And the women said, "We don't have a boat." "What are you talking about?" "Well, we're huddling together in a storm, a different kind of storm, a storm of violence. We're acting like huddling together is going to keep us safe, or some apparition is going to come out and save us. We need to get out of our boat." She did prompt a lively conversation. It went on for some time, and the women then went home. And later that night, the true story is that 70 women gathered together in one place in the neighborhood. And they brought with them salsa and chips. Salsa and chips. And someone had a guitar to play some songs from Chiapas. And some of the women brought scriptures. And they traveled to one gang turf and the next until they'd gone to all 8. Can you imagine the looks on the young men's faces? And they did that for 7 nights. At the end of the week, the violence had almost totally subsided. I heard the story from a witness. And the women began then to work with the young men. They began conflict resolution training. They built a tortilla factory that gave jobs. They built a daycare center that gave jobs. And eventually the women turned their attention to monitoring police behavior in the neighborhood. A true story. Something was going on here. It is not that they were not afraid. They had been afraid. We tell many, many stories of it like this, where people have been in fear and took a risk. They were creative. They tried something new. It wasn't the same old script. They liberated themselves from their role as frightened neighborhood residents. They liberated the young men. They made a connection, didn't they? A human connection with each other. I can imagine them getting to know each other's names and each other's stories. And the women were working together, and they had some resources, some spiritual resources. And the music and the food didn't hurt either. Well, I found that working with groups in peace work is not easy. Even church groups, even peace groups. And that is really what prompted me to start the nonviolence training program. I remember working at the Fellowship of Reconciliation when a young new staff member came in on a Monday, and she said, "It was just terrible, Janet. It was just terrible. We had our vigil on Saturday at the intersection in Nyack," and she said, "But it was awful what happened. I just don't know about nonviolence." And I said, "Well, what happened, Juliana?" "Well, you know, another vigil started, catty corner to us, in that same intersection. And they were for the war." And she said, "And 3 big guys came over, and they started putting their hands in our faces and yelling at us, and it was really very scary. And the woman in front of me raised up her metal peace sign and brought it down on somebody's head." "Well, what did you do, Juliana?" I grabbed her, and then she started crying. And she thanked me. So I wrote an article called "We're Hitting People Over the Head with Peace and It Doesn't Work." Gandhi is said to have claimed that he really was attracted to Christianity, for example, but he didn't see many people living it. So he decided not to. And the public is looking at us as peace people and people of faith. And they will turn away if we don't embody what we're talking about. So that was my reason for starting a peace training program called Creating a Culture of Peace, Nonviolence Training for Personal and Social Change. Nonviolence training had been related to 2 or 3 hour trainings. For civil disobedience, kind of training I also do. But that's not sufficient for really transforming us and empowering us. So the training, we call it CCP, Creating a Culture of Peace, is about that combination of action and reflection. I don't know if you know peace activists like I was, which was activist only. And although I was attending a faith congregation, I wasn't really using that in my peace work.